She works at her Wi-Fi, but once again, good morning. My name is Michael Vasquez, the founding principal at the Maiden Group, a social impact agency and research and consulting firm working to advance inclusive democracy in the space of religion and faith. Working with some of our incredible partners, which are here with us this morning to do our part to not just fight against autocracy and the issues that we are facing as a nation, but to really root our work together in hope. I believe that as much as it is true that on the horizon, there are all sorts of things that go bump in the night, the scary things, the threats to our democracy, the threats to bodily autonomy, a struggling economy, and trying to figure out a way forward out of a devastating pandemic that has paralyzed our country and the world for years, that has lost us, our close ones, and has really shifted how we understand one another as a community. As we work to move forward, it is important that we work together across all communities, across differences, to find pathways to not just restore our country, as President Biden often says, restoring the soul of a nation, but to also build and cultivate a society that is different than than the one that we have lived in, but we have always believed is possible, right? When we talk about democracy, we are talking about all the intersecting things that make a people free, all the intersecting things that make a society fair, and the work that it takes to achieve that. We may not have lived the democracy that is at the root and heart of this nation's ideals, but we do believe, I'm not going to speak for everyone here, but I do believe all of our panelists believe this deeply, that it is possible still to achieve the dream of a democracy that we know to be possible, yet we have not experienced quite yet in our lives. Last night's State of the Union address by President Biden was a reaffirmation of the work that we have ahead of us. Something that I am often reminded of is how Americans love to identify as hardworking people, right? We are a people that love work, right? Now, President Biden addressed the issue of capitalism as exploitation and extortion multiple times in his speech, but still at the core of the American ethic across communities is a love and desire to work in community, to create a society that works for everyone, that is better for everyone, so that everyone might flourish. And that is a gift, I think, about Americans and all members of American society. That's not exclusive to those who are American citizens, but those who participate in the day-to-day life and making of this nation better than it was when it was founded, better than it was just yesterday. And so to talk about the path forward and the work that we still have to do, right, to finish the job, as President Biden talked about last night, we have an amazing panel today to discuss what role do faith communities play in advancing democracy and the many issues that intersect with our dream of a fair and free society. I want to note, of course, that this panel is just one snippet of a very diverse, kaleidoscopic, beautiful faith community in this country. We do not have representation from every community, and thus this is only speaking on behalf of certain subsets and segments of our community. But our goal at the Maiden Group and with all of the organizations here gathered is to learn how we can continue to work and partner together with all members of the faith community from all different traditions and creeds and ideologies to advance justice, liberation, equity, and abundance for all. Today with us, we have Lauren Lowe-Relaford, who is the political director over at Sojourners, Christian Watkins, the Justice Systems and Democracy Reforms Government Relations Advocate at Network Lobby, a full mouthful of a title, but earned every syllable in there, and Jennifer Walker-Thomas, co-executive director for Mormon Women for Ethical Government. Thank you all for being with us this morning. I'm going to give it over to our panelists to introduce themselves a little bit and their work, and to share their initial takeaways and responses to last night's State of the Union. I'll start with you, Lauren.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. And please let me know if my sound goes out. I think we're all having internet troubles today, so I am not I'm not free from those. My name is Lauren Relaford. You can call me Lo since I'm amongst friends. And I'm a social worker, but I'm a political social worker. So I serve as political director for Sojourners. If I were to do an elevator speech, I like to say that Sojourners is the Atlantic magazine of Christian publications. I think that's the best way to kind of describe us. But I think sort of the mission and the spirit of Sojourners really is looking to James and realizing that faith without works is dead. And so it's not just enough for us to call ourselves Christians. What we really want to do is examine what it means to be a Christian in public life and what Scripture tells us about who we're supposed to be as a human being, but also who we're supposed to be for others. So we're very much rooted in these ideas of values of community, sort of Ubuntu interdependence, if you will. My role is, I cover all of our issue areas, so 12 issue areas, but democracy, voting, and governance, and the values, the sort of American values, which really transcend, I think, even across faith beliefs, is what really sort of anchors my work. And this whole idea is that sort of a Jesuit ideal, really, which I actually have tattooed on me. And it's this notion that whatever we do for the salvation of mankind or humankind, if we're going to be inclusive here, glorifies and honors God. And so as I was looking and listening to the speech, I think as a person of faith, just outside of my professional capacity, I was really looking to see how this speech aligned with what my faith values and, quite frankly, morals are, and whether or not he sort of sees that same vision for individuals and families and communities in the United States of America. From a very bipartisan, trying to be partisan, I think it was one of his stronger speeches just in general. And I think that while he also had some room to grow, some room to improve, I think especially when it comes to speaking to intentionally disenfranchised and marginalized communities in particular, I think he certainly touched on these issues, right? Social supports, child tax credit, paid family leave. These are things that are just across the board, things that matter to Americans and American families and American communities. However, we also have to recognize that there's a status quo baseline as to what is sort of successful or good in that. But there's tons of communities that fall under that status quo baseline. And so what may be sort of an issue across the board for Americans, we know that different communities are experiencing that burden at different levels. And so I will, in the spirit of partisanship, say that I was a bit disappointed in the fact that I don't think that he paid enough attention to the fact that, yes, we are a unified country, but there are individuals that have very, very different lived experiences that prevent us from really achieving or actualizing that right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which he outlined. I think and I'm writing a little bit about this for the Sojo Mail, but and maybe it's the Catholic in me, but it felt a little bit like a homily at times, because again, he's really examining what it means to be American, sort of what these American values are. And as a Catholic, I will say at an hour and 13 minutes, like we don't go that long. So that was very non-Catholic of him, right? But I think I really appreciated the fact that he didn't just talk about American values, but he assigned explicit sort of resources and supports or programs that align themselves with American values. So again, going back to the expanded child tax credit, I really appreciated this notion of the dignity of work. I think especially as there's fears of a global recession coming, of course, inflation is a huge issue. And I think a lot of people in a capitalist society sort of talk about work as a thing you have to do. You have to produce, you have to give into the system, but there's no real give and take, right? And I think what I heard in his speech is like, you can't just continue to expect the world from people and sort of bleed us dry without ensuring that we have the supports needed to actually be able to go into work and be our most productive selves. And so I do appreciate that he's starting to decouple this notion, very sort of American Western notion of, in order to be seen as a productive, valuable member of society, you have to be able to put in and take, and said, no, as part of a democracy, the goal is we all have a symbiotic, altruistic relationship with each other. And where one succeeds, just like the Bible says, we all rejoice. But when one suffers, we're all suffering. And so I'm going to leave that there because I know I can talk a little bit much and we're going to keep going. But I thought it was I was pleasantly surprised with the strong language. I also have to give him a shout out for negotiating the debt ceiling on the floor. Masterful masterclass in politics. But I think it did give a lot of faith advocates, especially those of us who represent or who are really focused on the needs of disenfranchised communities, a lot of room to work for, because it's very clear that while these issues, we're having these conversations, they aren't necessarily reaching the public tableau in a way in which they need to be. And so between now and election season, we're going to have a lot of work. But I think that there's hope for that. And so I'm really excited for the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Lo. I am right there with you. I think there was an invitation yesterday to remind to Americans to remember that we are part of a community in this together, right? Like it's not about saving my neck, but it's how do I make sure that my neighbor, right? Even just thinking like my neighbor across the hall were like pet sitting her puppy today while she's at work, and just thinking that might be like the most trite, simple example, but how do we care for one another as members of a shared society? And there was an invitation last night to remember, like, we're in this together, we have work to do together, but the goal is that everyone comes out on the other side, sharing in the abundance of this country. Minister Christian Watkins, I would love to have you jump in next.
Wow, how do I go after that, Lauren? You are a blessing to this community. Your eloquence is bar none. Thank you for that opening. It will keep my remarks short. I am Christian Watkins, the government relations advocate for Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. My portfolio includes democracy reform as well as criminal legal system reform. Network Lobby is a Catholic social justice organization that was started by 48 women religious here in Washington, D.C. in response to the liberation movements, the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s, both here at home and abroad. So, and we're celebrating we're continuing the celebration of our 50-year establishment. And I am grateful to be on staff with them. These sisters, they're ride or die. I know that there's a lot of them in the attendee list, as well as I want to give a shout out to my executive director, Mary Novak, who has fearlessly led this organization over the past couple of years, and grateful for her presence. And also, being the United Methodist minister that I am from Dallas, Texas, I would be remiss in not acknowledging my mother, who's also on the attendee list, Paula Watkins. Bless you for being here. But now to get down to the task at hand, Michael, thank you very much for the invitation. Jennifer, Lauren, it's good to be with you all. I am I had a warm stranging of the heart, as my United Methodist polity proclaims, that after the years of chaos and confusion and intentional defamatory rhetoric that's come out through our elections process, to hear his speech last night, which was remarkably different than his previous State of the Union, I am elated. I got fired up last night. And I appreciated his Baptist lengthiness of the sermon that he gave, because he hit some very good points. He hit the nail on the head several times. He was fearless in the face of heckling. He maintained his composure. President Biden did the job that he understood the assignment and did the job he was called to do to help America remember the various accomplishments that his administration, that the Biden-Harris administration accomplished over the past years. I mean, we can go down the list. It's 300 plus bipartisan legislation signed, 2 of the strongest calendar years of job growth in history, lowest unemployment rate in over 50 years, record decrease in the deficit, 2 strong years of small business development applications in history, over 10 million plus. The bipartisan infrastructure framework, the largest investment since Eisenhower's interstate transportation system, and the list goes on. I'm grateful to be a part of the working environment here in Washington, D.C., the faith advocacy community that has been working fearlessly with partners all across the country in order to make these bills happen, in order to make justice happen, to meet with congressional members and their staffs on a weekly basis, advocating for what's right for we the people. I just can't say enough about that speech last night. and Lauren, I appreciate you actually bringing up the different lived experiences, the mention of your desire to of President Biden to highlight the differences in lived experiences here in America. And I think his speech did that well. And also the attendees that he had invited, that he and others of the administration, other members of Congress invited, definitely did show that. With network lobbying, we honor and we uplift the life and dignity of the human person. And as diversely and wonderfully as we all are made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, human life is sacred. And that in the dignity of the human person is the foundation of the moral vision for our society. And we cannot be devoid of that, no matter what faith tradition you come from. That's a main tenet of what God proclaims to us. God, called by many names, has all called us into the life of progress, the life of justice, the life of love and of grace. And, you know, his speech did resonate in that way for me last night. And, you know, I do appreciate the invitation to join in on the work of participating in being what his predecessor called an informed and engaged electorate. You know, letting people know that there is that open communication with their members of Congress, with the administration, to, you know, to voice their opinions and to also get the knowledge that they need to have in order to participate in the upcoming elections. It was said by one of my colleagues last night that the 2024 elections have already begun. And this was his keynote speech in order to engage the electorate, to be involved in the process of getting him or maybe someone else in his shoes elected to finish the work. And I'll stop there.
You were ready to give a Baptist sermon right there. I see you. You were just warming up. But no, I appreciate that note at the end, right? Like this is the beginning of a new election cycle, right? That it was both, as he said at the end, right, his constitutional duty to deliver the State of the Union, and the State of the Union is strong. At least that was how he ended his address last night. But it was also, right, an invitation to consider what the options for the future are, right? There is an election on the horizon, and as we'll get into in our discussion here shortly, there is a lot of tension and discord, and to put it lightly, and how we decide as an electorate, how we decide as a nation, the direction of this country will come down once again to a very contentious election. And so we are on the eve of that. There's not an election soon, but especially for those of us deep in this work, or those who track, like all of our lovely attendees today, it is on the horizon. And so how do we understand last night's speech, not just as a pulse check for where the country is, but also as what is the debate that we will be engaged in deeply? And we saw some of that play out very viscerally last night. But what is the debate in front of us? And I do think in large part, that debate is what direction do we want this country to go in? And not in such simple terms as like, well, do we want a tighter budget, or do we want a more abundant budget? But who are we going to be as a nation, and what direction will we follow? As President Biden often retorts, right, we are dancing at the precipice between democracy and autocracy, not just here in the US, but around the world. He delivered that with hope, right? Like his old boss taught him a lot, I think, about like what it means to carry that spirit of hope, and that rang true last night. But I think that remains a question for all of us to consider. How do we contextualize the tension and the struggle that we find ourselves currently in, but root that in the spirit of hope about what could be? Jennifer, I would love to hear your response to last night.
Well, thanks. I'm actually really appreciative of that lead up. My name is Jennifer Thomas, and I am a co-executive director for Mormon Women for Ethical Government. And our organization has two key missions. The first is to advocate for ethical governance. And then the second is to help women become independent, informed, powerful political actors who can help build exactly the world that we are talking about today. For us, our work is rooted in four values that I saw coming out repeatedly in the State of the Union, and I was really appreciative of that. And those are faithful, peaceful, nonpartisan, and proactive. And for us as an organization, we certainly work on policy, and there are things that we get behind. But more than anything, I think we are working to build exactly what Michael was just talking about, to help our nation figure out exactly who we want to be when we grow up. We're still growing up. We're still figuring that out. But without a lodestar and without a common set of principles and values that we're working toward, it is really easy, as we witness, to devolve into pretty negative things when you exist in a pluralistic environment where if we really have all of our political and civic engagements rooted only in power and the ability to coerce, in a society that is increasingly diverse and pluralistic, that is not going to go well for any of us. It's not even going to go well for the people who have short-term wins. And so for us as an organization, we really constantly are trying to push ourselves and our members and anyone within the sound of our voice back to the core values that we all share as citizens of this nation, things that are really important to who we are and to the progress that we've made. There's a lot more progress to be made, but the progress that we have made rests in a lot of the things that have already been talked about today. For us, I think two of the really key elements of that are part of that faithful element for us as an organization is a very sincere and deeply rooted belief that every single person within the sound of my voice, every citizen in this nation, everyone who's not a citizen of this nation, is of equal worth and is a child of God. They have value. That value is often misattributed in our society according to wealth or power or education or all sorts of other things. But reminding ourselves as an organization, as the women in our organization, turning back to our faith to remember that all of those things are mismarkers. None of those things are real. The most real thing is that we are really have divinity in each of us and are children of God. And for us, how does that flow out into the political sphere? It means that faith can't be used to coerce or to exert force or power on other people. It means that faith should inform all of our work to make sure that all of those people have the equal opportunity to live out their potential and their value. So that's kind of how I see faith moving into all of this. But in terms of the State of the Union, one of the things that has been one of our lodestars is we didn't need to invent anything because the vision of what we are trying to accomplish had been so beautifully previously articulated by Dr. King as he expressed his desire for the beloved community. And we have a strong faith tradition within our community of a principle of Zion, that's something that we are building towards. And Dr. King's framing of the beloved community gives us the excellent opportunity to use that religious framework in a civic setting without imposing our specific dogma or doctrine onto anyone. It allows us to build towards something that is faith-based, that is independent of a particular faith or party. And part of the beloved community is a lot of the things that we've talked about today. It means that we recognize people's inherent worth, that they are working together and moving forward on a shared purpose, that we have set up structures and systems that allow people the broadest possible range of making good choices. I think sometimes we tend to be in our society a little bit harsh, and we would rather we'd rather stop anyone from making a bad choice. And the cost of that is that we limit the range of literally millions of people to make good choices. And at MWEG, we are always, always going to get behind movements or ideas that expand the opportunity for people to make good choices as independent actors, so that they can be empowered people to help build our society together. A couple of things that jumped out at me from the State of the Union, and then I'll stop and cede the floor. But we by the way have very long sermons, so I will try not to bring that to all of you today. We just downgraded from 3-hour church to 2-hour church. So but I think one of the things that we really appreciated was this renewed, very forceful call to protect democracy. Just like Michael mentioned, we do see ourselves in a sort of a struggle between democracy and autocracy. But like President Biden, we actually feel very optimistic about that. This isn't the first time that this has happened in our nation, and it won't be the last. And hopefully with every iteration, we get better at it. We do it with less bloodshed. We do it with less hatred. And I think we have the opportunity to do that here. And we are on a path to do that. And so I think one of the things that's really important to us as an organization is to remember that at the core of all this is a fight for democracy and a fight for the individual right to participate actively in our governance. I think the other two things that really jumped out at me that I was so appreciative of that speak to our values as an organization is President Biden's consistent willingness to work in a bipartisan way. And that doesn't mean that he gives up his political values or that he cedes. I think that no president should necessarily have to, but I think that the best presidents recognize that they have a set of values and a set of priorities that they're working toward, and recognize that for those priorities and values to have a lasting impact on our nation and not to be subject to really aggressive political change, they need to come about in a bipartisan way. When there's bipartisan buy-in, those solutions last longer. Finally, I think the last thing I want to say that I think we were very appreciative of as an organization is this element of him having a vision. I think that that is something that we can require of our leaders. It doesn't mean that as citizens, we all have to agree with that individual's vision, but if there isn't an affirmative vision for where we're going, if there isn't a positive vision of what our nation can be, if there isn't a hopeful and inclusive voice calling us all in, then the likelihood of us succeeding is very, very limited. And I think that this has been a lovely hallmark of this particular presidency is a willingness to stand his ground, which each of us, like I said, may or may not individually agree with, but at the same time, a willingness to demonstrate repeatedly over and over again, a willingness to dialogue with and work with others. And I think that that peaceful approach in the best way, in the best sense of peacemaking, not just peacekeeping, is the kind of dialogue that that has the potential to lead us forward in a unified way as a nation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer. All amazing opening remarks. And I will say, I did visit an LDS church once and did spend approximately 8 hours there that Sunday. And it was
once you're in, it's hard to get out. Lots of talking.
Yeah, lots of time. Like, come to the next thing, and now there's food, and then there's another thing.
And now there's food.
We're here all day. I was well fed and great conversation. So I do appreciate a long day at church. But I love this notion of like, who do we want to be when we grow up, right? And if we are to build that beloved community, having a shared vision of what that beloved community looks like, understanding what that means, and knowing that there will be disagreements on how we get there, right? There will be disagreements on the particulars, but if there is alignment on our values of liberation, of freedom, of fairness, right? If there's alignment in that you are my neighbor, right? I started undergrad at Sisters of St. Joseph College up in Massachusetts, and it was every day, the reminder that we are one another's dear neighbor, and how do we infuse that into our political engagements, into our organizing work, into just our understanding of one another, right? It's simple, I think. And I think every religious tradition has some equivalent concept of I don't know you, but you live down the hall from me, or down the street from me, or across town from me, or across the country from me. And your life experience is different. The way you show up in the world is different. The way the world sees you is different, right? President Biden shared that about the talk that Black and brown folks get from our parents growing up, right? as an attempt to remind America that like everyone's experience of America is different, and yet we are all members of a shared society. So how do we come into alignment on vision, right? Like we want a society where everyone feels safe, and that's not just me and mine feeling safe, but that's you and yours feeling safe, right? And if we can get into an alignment about the vision of our future, in the way that you so aptly put it, Jennifer, like who do we want to be when we grow up? I think it's simple, right? Then we can really, I think, more easily engage on the sometimes more complicated questions of how do we get there, right? How do we become who we want to be? But if we are in alignment about who we are and where we're going, I think those questions become less complicated. I think the tension eases, the temperature goes down, and there's more room, right? I think, as a lot of folks might know, like my background is in LGBTQ organizing, and it is a complicated moment, right? President Biden mentioned passing the Equality Act last night, and I do think, right, like there's more to be said about the issues facing the LGBTQ community right now, the threats against trans folks, the crackdown in schools, and making it more difficult for queer folks to simply exist in the world. And I think the times where I have found the most success in engaging in these complex questions about something so basic as dignity has been when folks seemingly across the aisle, right, across the political spectrum for me, have been willing to acknowledge my dignity and the dignity of other members of the LGBTQ community and say, like, I have disagreements about theological questions and other larger questions, but I do agree that you should not have to walk down the street and worry that you might get jumped, that trans folks who are experiencing increasing threats of violence in this country don't have to worry for their lives, right? And I think there's agreement there. We should be able to get to agreement there, right? Like, and I think that's where some of what we're all sharing here is if we are all members of a shared society, for all of the issues that we're discussing, right, of all the intersecting policy questions and societal questions that we face, how do we come into agreement that your religious beliefs, your theological questions, your theological groundings might be different than mine, and yet we agree that everyone should be safe, that everyone should have, it should experience levels of abundance, right? That no one should have to worry that the job that they are working full-time, a grueling job, does not pay enough for them to be able to afford rent and food and childcare, right? That the details should not be that difficult if we can come to an agreement that that everyone should feel these baseline needs met. So we've been obviously talking about democracy today, right? Like I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say democracy. I think that I'm sure all of our attendees know, I'm sure we all know, right? Like, but the word democracy can be an esoteric word that's like, yeah, democracy. There's the Constitution that folks may or may not have read, right? Like there's, we've read snippets of, like, there's stuff in there that I know, and there's stuff in there that I don't know, right? Shout out to the lawyers in the room, right? Who are like, well, I definitely know every line. But I think when we talk about, well, there's autocracy on the horizon and there's a threat toward democracy, people were like, well, what? People who work in the spaces that we work in, whether you're directly living in DC or not, have like an assumed answer, like, well, yeah, I know what we mean when we say democracy. And there's a lot of words that I think we could put into that same category of like, we know there's a shared language or an assumed shared language, but I would love to hear from everyone, and please dialogue on this. When we talk about democracy, what is it that you are speaking to? And what is it that you are envisioning when we say this is the democracy we hope, sorry to keep using your language, Jennifer, the democracy we hope we will grow up into? Feel free to just jump in.
Well, I'll take the first stab at it. in order to understand democracy, we've got to understand the society that we live in. And that's where my working definition of politics comes into play. Politics is how we order ourselves in community. And democracy is the system in which we do that. Democracy for us is our way of each person being represented. Each person has their vote. Each person has their voice, and we have those elected officials that we vote for in order to represent those interests in the larger scales of governance, whether it's local, state, or federal. And so that whole system, that whole democratic system of electing leaders in order to represent our common interests and our own personal interests as well is my layman's definition for democracy. There are those that want to thwart that process because of their denial of the sacred worth of others, their denial of even belief in the system itself. There's many that want to cause distrust in the system. But we know when people are engaged, when people are informed, the system works. May not work 100% of the time, may not work for everybody's best interest. However, but it does work. And when we get more people on the same page, or even in the same paragraph on the same page, then things will work out better for our common good.
Thank you. Lauren.
So first, I mean, I feel like, or I truly believe that democracy is predicated on the notion that everyone has an equitable, which is very different than equal, and just, which is also very different than equitable and equal, share in power and access and representation in the United States. And that is in part an issue of self-determination and autonomy. I'm going to pull out a little social work speak. And so inherently the role of democracy, for me, at least my understanding, is to ensure and promote and protect the autonomy and self-determination of individuals within a bounded area or a well-defined area. It also inherent in that, because if you're going to live in a society with other individuals, you can't just act alone. And we saw a lot of that during COVID. Folks are like, well, it's my right not to wear a mask. Okay, but it's also my right not to get sick, bro. So let's weigh that. But it also inherent in democracy is this understanding that what you do in one space is going to have an impact on other people. And so there are some limitations to how we act within the democratic sphere of influence, right? Because we can't just push for things and focus solely on our self-autonomy. We have to understand that we are interdependent beings. And so therefore our democracy is also set up to ensure the rights, equitable privileges, just powers to all individuals. And so I think that to what Jennifer was talking to, that's sort of part of the growing that we need to do. And I think people have to realize, like, America, relative to everywhere else, is very new, right? And our version of democracy is going to be different than France's version of democracy, than England's version of democracy, than other areas. And so we really are trying to grow and change in these inflection points. And from a social work sort of clinical perspective, I think particularly now we're at a major inflection point where a lot of sort of our resurgent worst tendencies have come to the surface, right? It's not like a lot of these insurrectionists, this January 6th rhetoric, this white Christian nationalism, none of this is new. These are not new threats to democracy, because they always are going to sit on the opposite end of democracy. And wherever democracy really starts to thrive and flourish, just like the devil, autocracy and fascism and sedition and treason are going to rear its ugly heads, because they sense that their power is waning, and that can't happen. And so what I think when we talk about democracy, what we're doing right now is an exercise in actually continuing to define it, so that way we can then apply it to the systems and the structures that run our governments, that fuel our communities, and that help people grow and thrive. But then part of the problem is, and I think people don't realize, is that we're in a fight, because when the original founders sat and talked about sort of who man is, they didn't even say human, they said man. So we already are thinking from a very narrow perspective. And And one of those men that was involved, James Madison, was involved in, being a founder and pulling this country together, owned or enslaved 600 human beings, right? So I think it's disingenuous for a lot of people on both sides to claim that this is the democracy that we're always fighting for. No, I think a lot of folks are fighting for that pure vision of democracy that really represents the sort of inherent sort of communal understanding of a group of individuals with shared power, versus sort of the way in which it was really corrupted when the Declaration and Constitution, and I have a mini one, so don't tell me I haven't read it, right? I've had this bad boy since
I know
high school.
you read it.
Right. And I'm not going to age myself, but like I've had this for quite some time. And again, when you read about it, it does kind of, it rings hollow when it says that, all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? At the same time, when you have 600 people basically making you money with little to no pay. And so I think that is where we are in this nation, and that's where we've always been, is we're just in a period where we've reached a stuck point, or we've reached a point in our healing or growing journey where the issues of the past, the harms of the past are continuing to rear their ugly heads, because you can't kill an idea, right? Democracy is an idea, it's a concept, and we are taking that concept and applying it. And we realize that the application has not done so well. And so in pure scientific method, what happens, you go back and you look at your hypothesis, you look at your formula, you see where things aren't working, and you try to rejigger them. And so I think that I'm going to really just keep it from a conceptual space. I really think that part of the task that President Biden has, and quite frankly, faith advocates has, is to really make sure that we have this shared language and a shared understanding of what democracy is moving forward. Because once, I think, Michael, to what you're saying, once we have this real shared vision of democracy that breaks down the isms and sort of the things that exist in the world that really try to box people in into a certain ideal of what it has to be. White Christian nationalism is one, and I know we'll get to that. But just want to say this ahead of time, white Christian nationalism hurts white people. We'll get into that later, but I just want you guys to know that off the top, it's hurting you as well. It's not just a tool to harm Black and Brown and Native and Indigenous people. And I think once we have this shared identity, then we can really move forward to fix the systems. But unfortunately, like, we can't. The wheels are already running. And so we're just kind of at a point. And I think that's where you see the tension, is people with these very deeply held beliefs and this very deeply held understanding of who has access in this country are unfortunately in power, and they're fighting against those who see a more inclusive, a more just society, a more just understanding of democracy. And those fights are happening not just at the State of the Union, but we know they're happening in Congress. That's why you see things like Respect for Marriage Act, Equality Act, the Crown Act, right? We're talking about the dignity of individuals and our ability to just exist and exist the way that God created us. And so, I think it's again, I can sit in this very conceptual space, and I tried to shuttle things down when I was thinking about democracy. But I think that is what I think of a democracy. And I think what Biden tried to do was define some of that in his speech, and then use specific policy prescriptives like child tax credit, like paid family leave, like police reform, like dignity of work, to underscore like this is then what a democracy does to support those individuals and to ensure that everyone can exercise self-autonomy within sort of the boundaries of the responsibilities that we have to another.
Lauren, out of all my biblical exploration and research, I have never met a blind woman, and your eyes are definitely open. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And just the explanation of how we can participate, how we should be better informed, how we can understand the nuances of then versus now. History repeats itself because we don't, in my opinion, we don't learn the lessons the first time. So with all the backstory on how America came to be, and the racist undertones and the misogyny and all the other isms that we are still plagued with, I want to go back to what we all alluded to before, that President Biden does have a vision. The Biden-Harris administration has that vision to restore or to reform, transform our democracy into a better, inclusive, representative system. And I'm grateful for it. I'm here for it. I'm still going to be pushing for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, the Disclose Act, all the acts that will make our system, make our democracy system, our democratic system safer, freer, and more representative. I mean, because dark money, it definitely has a major influence on who gets seen, who gets elevated to the highest positions, that kind of thing. So, yeah, yes, thank you, Lauren.
I'm going to punt the next question. I'm going to tie them together for you, Jennifer, just being conscious of time. So I'd love to answer that, but also with a follow-up question from the audience. I think to speak to what everyone is saying, like, and draw something out, right, at the heart of democracy, right, even, right, like, Greece is attributed to being, right, like, the birthplace of Western democracy. And even there, right, like, who in Athenian society was allowed to vote and participate in the so-called new system where everyone was free was limited, right, like, to land owning men, right? Much like our democracy at its founding, and even to this day, right, like, who gets to participate remains an outstanding question, because at the core, one of the questions at the core of what a democracy is the question of who is a person, right? And thus, who gets to participate, which gets to this next question that I want you to take first, Jennifer, is from Kathleen. Kathleen asked about Catholic parishes, but I think this applies across the board. How do we get Catholic parishes to overcome resistance to diversity values and become signs of a new transformation to the beloved community that our local bishops may resist? And I think the question, right, like, at the heart there is, like, how do all of our communities, right, like, talking at the micro level, not just in Congress, right, like, but back home, how do we answer the question of who's a person and recognize that all persons are persons, right? And help and understand that that is at the core of the diversity, the DEI fights and battles that we're facing, right? Like, is, you know, that too is a person, and thus they have, all right, how do we overcome that? And please tie that into, like, the question of what is a democracy?
Okay, I'm going to go in a weird direction. So ride this train with me for 2 seconds. So years ago, when I had a very young family and I was doing a lot of research about family culture, I was like, how do I build a good family culture, right? A really interesting study got put in front of me. And it was this idea that there are 3 ways that families can see themselves. And one is sort of a descending narrative. It's like everything happens bad for our family. We were great, and then we fell off, and it's been a bummer. There's the ascending narrative, which is sort of the traditional American rags to riches. It's the immigrant story, whatever you want to call it. It's like, we came in, we built, we won. We came, we saw, we conquered, right? And then there's the third kind of narrative, which is the cyclical narrative. And that means that our family fell, our family rose, our family fell, our family rose, but we were constantly sort of figuring it out, iterating and moving upward and forward. And I think that the reason I bring that is I think that it ties into everything that has just been said, is that one of the extreme failures that we have experienced as a nation has been a result of over-investing in an ascending narrative. This idea that we are always climbing, we are always better than we were the day before, because that also invests, that narrative has to have a set of winners. And I think Lauren really nailed it when she said that we all know, everybody knows who the winners of that, who have been the people that have been the highlighters, the people that shine in the ascending narrative, the way we've always told that story in America. And it is not inclusive, and it does not represent an understanding of the fact that ascension has not happened equally or for everyone. And in fact, that in very real spaces, it has happened on the backs of other people, at the expense of other people. But if we can reframe that as a nation as a cyclical narrative, I actually think that unlocks the power of democracy, because to me, we've talked about this a lot at MWEG. Democracy is foundationally a question of power. It's a foundationally question, answering the question of power in our nation. Where does power originate? Where does it then flow from? How does it aggregate? How is it controlled once it's aggregated? And how do we make sure that it always stays true to its source? And in a democracy, it flows from exactly what we've all talked about, the inherent deep value of an individual. So to tie these two ideas together, I think if we can figure out new ways to tell our story, if we can figure out new ways to explain that this nation and as a people, we only win when we rise from having fallen. I think that brings a couple of things into focus. First, it sort of puts forward a whole different set of people as having value in our society. Because in that narrative, the people who have real value to me are the people who have overcome. They're the people who have descended into the hell and have figured out how to pull themselves out and how to lead the rest of us out. And that is almost never the rich and the powerful. In fact, it isn't by definition. It's usually the weak and the oppressed. And that relates so powerfully to me, anyway, to my Christian faith, to this idea of redemption, to this idea of fighting for the oppressed, of those people being the most valuable in the kingdom of God and in the sight of God, and those having the most hope for the future. Because I couldn't agree more with Lauren. One of the things we forget with the ascending narrative, one of the things we forget when we deny the power of people and aggregate power in really negative ways, we forget that the people that are truly most lastingly being corrupted are the people using that power inappropriately and the people that they then hand that power to do in the same ways. The people that are most corrupted by that, who are most broken, who are most ruined, are not the weak and the oppressed. They are the oppressors. And changing that framework is, I think, really, really important to helping people in congregations understand that through the lens of faith, they want absolutely to do everything in their power to avoid being the oppressor and to avoid being the one that wields power inappropriately, because things will not go well for them. You know, this is not where we all want to be standing before God. We want to be the people who ranged ourselves on the side of those that God called his most beloved. So that's like sort of an impassioned defense for it. But I think that for us, our work democratically stems absolutely from that idea that all people are valuable, redemption is possible, and the people that that win in the most holy and sacred of systems are always the people that lift others up, never the people that oppress.
Absolutely. And yes, Christian, please jump in. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Jennifer, that explanation was masterful. You know, and also we got to remember that the ascending narrative is not sustainable. It will ruin people and cause more people harm. And we know that hurt people hurt people.
It's a lie. Yeah.
Yeah, the cycle continues. That cycle of oppression continues. And even the ones that are doing the oppression are locked into their own state of oppression. So continuing with that cyclical narrative of continuing to overcome in order to become our best selves through our experiences, that's literally the American dream right there. You know, becoming our best selves. And to answer the question of what do we do in order to create more beloved community within our church communities, within our home communities that will antagonize leadership and whatnot. You know, according to the biblical narrative, if you're not agitating the empire, if you're not agitating, standing in faith and good conscience with others. So, I mean, the disciples went out 2 by 2 for a reason, because one person didn't know that no two people know the same thing. So they're able to combat each other. Moving forward, they're able to combat the things that come at them equitably and faithfully, right? So in love and grace, but also standing with the assuredness that God has given them a spirit of fear, not, you know, the spirit of, God didn't give them a spirit of fear, but one of love, joy, and peace. So like, as we move forward in creating beloved community, we got to understand that, as we build it, there will be opposition, but do not be afraid of that opposition, because if you're not agitating empire, you're not doing something right. So, I mean, we as we reach for those, as we dream into our Christian imagination to build better community together, more inclusive community, more less of what is prescribed by patriarchy and all the isms that have shaped our Christianity, our faith traditions, that has deranged them, that has disconfigured them. I lean into who's not at the table and how can we widen the circle in order to close gaps. That kind of thinking, that kind of rationale, continuously given, continuously questioned, even within our church councils, in our church leadership meetings, in our evangelism models that we have in our community, how the church community is helping and partnering with the community at large, rather than just sitting there and waiting for people to come. Those kinds of activities, those kinds of things would be beneficial for the church community, as well as the advocacy outward towards making justice happen, like Micah 6:8 calls us into. So I hope that answered the original question. And Jennifer, thank you once again for offering your academic, your intelligence on agitating us into a little bit better lived experience together.
Thank you all. This has been incredibly rich, and we're going to go a little over time, and there are some phenomenal questions that we will not be able to answer. I do want to acknowledge the folks in the chat. Thank you for the questions you're submitting. I would love to have some follow-up conversations with folks and invite, we can continue to have these dialogues. There are questions from Nadia about how do we partner with groups like the American Humanist Association and the nearly 30% of people who are now religiously unaffiliated, and how do we partner with secular non-theist communities like theirs with values-aligned religious communities against things like white Christian nationalism, which in the follow-up to this, I will share the Public Religious Research Institute released a new survey report just this morning on Christian nationalism in America. So I will share that. So we didn't get to dive into that more deeply. And how do we build solidarity and mutual aid networks across communities, grassroots communities, across both secular and religious communities, in pursuit of this idea, in pursuit of this vision of a shared society where everyone's value is both acknowledged and protected and defended and safeguarded, where we can work together to create a community as a nation that doesn't leave anyone out of the promises of these founding documents, which I'll tap Elizabeth's question in the chat as our closing question. I'll give everyone 30, 45 seconds to condense. The question was, is it possible to discuss what all faiths share in common with the faith values expressed in our founding documents, whether that's the Declaration or the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? And I kind of want to tweak that. My apologies, Elizabeth. I want to play with the question a little bit, right? I think, as we've acknowledged, right, at the founding of our democracy, as in other democracies around the world, it is imperfect, and people were intentionally left out, and at times unintentionally left out of that vision and that promise. And yet, the question before us, right, is what do we share in common? What do our different faith values share in common with these founding documents? And I would say maybe more refined, this shared vision of a democracy where everyone can participate and feel honored and welcomed and affirmed. But what is faith's role in preserving and protecting our democracy, and not just sharing the vision, but enacting and bringing that vision into existence? And that'll be our closing question.
I guess I will take that on first.
I was hoping you would, Lo.
Oh no, the pressure is on. And so this actually gets into two of the questions I think that were asked were sort of what do we share? What are the values? And can people of faith, can they share values with non-Christians, atheists even? And this is something that I actually said to a group of students on Monday is, I believe, and this may get me excommunicated, I believe that at the end of the day, whether you call yourself a Christian, a Buddhist, a Muslim, flying spaghetti monster, Pastafarian, what have you, I think there is just a general like shared value of uplifting and honoring the inherent dignity and worth of humanity in each and every one of us. And of course it gets distorted along the lines when it starts to become who is one of us. But I think to what Jennifer was saying was that I genuinely believe that regardless of race, space, time, place, gender, God created you for a purpose. Whether you believe in him or not, you are here for a reason. And that reason is to do something greater than self. Which is why, again, I have the Jesuit motto tattooed on me, right? And that reason is to uplift, to uphold, to invest in not just the survival, but the thriving of your fellow human, your environment, and every creation on the face of this earth. And so when it comes to those shared values, when you talk to people of different faiths or people who just don't even believe, they ultimately believe wholeheartedly in just being nice and kind to other people. And so I think that that is a shared value that we have. But I think a lot of our labels, like they tend to do, divide and distort. And as a person of faith, the way that I understand it is anything that seeks to divide or distort or to bring about chaos is inherently evil. And so I'm going to look at anything, regardless of where they come from, even my own, as evil when you seek to break apart the bonds that God has created together. Because again, remember, God said that we are all part of the same vine. So anyone who is unnecessarily trimming branches based on their own aesthetic is doing something that is inherently anti-faith, anti-God, anti-Christian, for me, at least. Again, that's very controversial. I think I would also say that when you look at that frame, then you consider things, and hopefully, and I'm going to say this even as sort of white Christians or even white individuals, you also understand that these notions of white Christian nationalism, white supremacy inherently harm you as well, right? That is the reason why Fred Hampton was in the Appalachian Mountains talking to individuals with Confederate flags all over the place who sprinkled the N-word everywhere like it was, some sort of seasoning, and got them to come and actually stand and do security for Black Panthers and members of Latino communities in Chicago, because he got folks to understand that ultimately, at the end of the day, if power is concentrated in one area like it is, we all suffer. And not only that, these notions of who is deserving or, who fits in this ideal of whiteness also excludes a lot of white people, right? Because you're not going to be a landed, rich, white male with affluence and wealth and extreme power, even if you are a white male, right? There's a certain subgroup in that. And I'll share an article. Even James Madison noted that in Federalist 10. He made it very clear that we don't want those people talking about uneducated, unlanded, non-slave owning white people to become part of the governance. And so that really is what I think, one, we kind of share these values. And then that's the challenge that we're trying to transcend, is those people who don't hold those same values, who sit there and say, if you are a Christian, this is what your faith has to look like. If you are an American, this is what you have to look like. If you are white, this is what your whiteness has to look like. And so I think that when you listen to the State of the Union, or if you are a person of faith, what you're doing is inherently you're fighting against forces that are seeking to skew the identity that God gave you. And so I think that's my brain is going like a mile a minute now, so I apologize. And I'm dealing with COVID brain fog, so I apologize if I seem a little scattered. But so I feel like that is sort of the takeaway, is that we all really are in this fight, and ultimately we can call ourselves Christians, we can call ourselves whatever, but I am a human being first and foremost. And my duty and responsibility, I have rights, of course, to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but I have a responsibility to every creation, because I am intrinsically linked through the Spirit and through God, to ensure that if I'm eating, you eat. If I'm happy, you're happy. If you're suffering, then I'm suffering as well, right? And so I think that that is just sort of how we tie into it. And I know that there are a lot of people who say, if you aren't this, or if you don't do this, then you can't be a good person. I think that there are a lot of good people out there. And I also think that there are a lot of people who have been hurt by the system historically, who are actually really trying to help. I think there are a lot of hurt people who hurt people, and they're the exception and not the rule. Because when you look at those hurt people that are hurting people now, they may be very, very loud, and they may be very, very destructive, but 81 million people voted for Joe Biden as well, right? So there's clearly a large majority of people with some sense and people with some care, regardless of what they believe in. And I think that we just really need to focus on the fact that we are here, and we need to stand rooted in our identity, and stand firm in our dignity, and fight for the dignity of others as well. Because ultimately, that's what God is. That's who God is. And that's the whole point of Jesus as well. So.
Lauren, thank you.
Michael. Oh, Christian, I'll let you go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Lauren, thank you for that setup there. Being the United Methodist minister that is Jesuit educated, I can appreciate the ad majorem de gloriam, for the greater glory of God do we do all of our things. Yes, indeed. With that understanding, and being that that most of us, Jennifer, I don't know if you were seminary trained or not, but being seminary trained has afforded us the opportunity, Michael, Lauren, the ability to be able to study other religions, to be able to study other faith traditions outside of the Christian sphere. And at least out of my experiences, we all have the common threads that are prevalent not only in Christianity, but throughout history as well. Even the faith traditions that have born and died, the traditions that are still hanging on, even the new traditions. There's something pure about the decentralized sense of self and the acknowledgement of the transcendence of God, but also the intrinsic worth of community. Running down the line of Catholic social teachings in relationship to the answer, we all can agree on the life and dignity of the human person. God created Adam and Eve, which we can go into a whole exegetical theological explanation on that. But at its core, God created humanity. God created creation in God's diverse image, right? To be helpmates for each other, not to lord over one another. So in that recognition that life and dignity is inherent to the human being, we have to be able to recognize it in other folks. And by nature, we're called to family. We're not born individually. We may die individually, but there will be some folks to come around us after we die, prayerfully. But we don't live in isolation. We're not lonely islands navigating this thing called life. So there is a call to family, to community, and to participate in it. Because, that's the core of the gospel, right? That we live in community, that we contribute to community, that we go out 2 by 2 to help out other folks, that if someone in community has not, and someone else does, we're all shared. That those resources are shared, and we all have rights and responsibilities to care for each other, to nurture one another, and to also advocate for the least, last, and left out of the community. So there's an option for the poor and vulnerable, and the ones that are working, the ones that are able to work, the ones that have the wherewithal to work, they deserve dignity themselves. Slavery, it was a dastardly thing, but it still keeps happening. We still see it in our criminal legal system reform. We still see it in our criminal legal system. We still see it in other parts of the world. It's prevalent. But workers deserve their dignity to be honored by the companies that employ them. And so that lends us to solidarity. What affects me directly affects others indirectly, and vice versa. Martin Luther King said a quote that I continue to butcher. We are intrinsically tied in the garment of destiny, in our diversity, in everything that we do. So that leads me to the last point: the care for God's creation. If we can't care for, if we can't care for creation, then we won't have a sustainable life to live. As RuPaul, as the prophetess RuPaul says, how the hell can I love myself if I can't love nobody else? And that goes reverse. How can I love other people? How can I not love other people and not love myself? So that's where I'll end.
Thank you, sir.
So I will add just really briefly to that. I think the way we can work together is simple. I think one of the things that we encourage women to do is to sit down and figure out at base what are their needs, in the sense that we have to acknowledge that governance and government, they're temporal solutions. These are not spiritual enterprises, right? And so we can't run them like churches, and we can't expect them to run like churches where people are in alignment with a very particular value or doctrine. But we can have underlying values and beliefs that tie us together in this temporal exercise. And one of I think the most important things we can do is figure out what we need as individuals. What are our core, most basic needs? Michael has touched on those a lot. You all have this need to be seen, to exist, to have your rights protected equally, to have opportunities like other people's do. I mean, we can go through the list, but it actually is really quite short when you get down to it. And one of the things that we really encourage in MWEG is what we call Second Commandment citizenship, which means that you take those needs, you figure out what those needs are that are absolutely core to your survival, to your happiness, to you being able to thrive. And you look at them through the lens of the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, and to figure out exactly how you are going to, at every step that you're trying to set up governing systems that protect and support those needs that you have, that you make sure that you are fighting equally to make sure that the needs and hopes of other people are equally protected. And I think if we do that, I think that runs through all of our major faith traditions, whether you want to call it the second commandment like we do, whether you think about it as the golden rule. It's this idea that to live a meaningful life, you can't just focus on yourself. You have to see other people as equally valuable, and you have to structure a life in which you and others can live in harmony, moving towards a greater purpose. And I think if we do that, then people of faith are in an extraordinary position to contribute meaningfully to our governing systems without imposing or using those faiths to aggregate power. And that is all I would say. I think we're in a very unique position to contribute as people of faith. And I don't think we should hesitate, because I think that at every one of those cycles that we talked about in America, people of faith have played an important role in animating that rise out of hardship.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you all. It's hard to beat these closing words. So I'll just say yes, right? I think that people of faith have always been a part of the story, and whether for good or for evil, right? But the beautiful moments, right, where people of faith have stood side by side with all other members of society, whether they're people of faith or they're non-theists, right? Whether they're people from different religious traditions or not, right? We've stood together in defense of our democracy in the larger kind of esoteric sense that we discussed, but in the particulars also, and what it means to protect our rights to a fair and just and equitable economy, what it means to defend our rights to love, what it means to defend our rights to be an active participant in the development of a society that is intended to be for everyone's benefit, and for everyone's sacred good, and for everyone to see themselves in the notion of being a member of a beloved community that seeks to uphold, defend, nourish, and invest in one another. I want to thank everyone for joining today, whether you are watching this recording or you are here live for the discussion. I want to thank especially Lauren and Christian and Jennifer for your expertise, your brilliance, your time, your investment, for wrestling and struggling with internet issues and just being present today. There's a lot before us, and the investment of time and presence is a gift. I also want to thank our friends at Auburn Seminary for being a co-sponsor of this event today. But to everyone, on behalf of the Maiden Group and all of our friends here, thank you for joining, and we look forward to chatting again soon. Take care, everyone.